Good evening, and welcome to a community conversation of the Lorenzen Center for Faith and Work, a program of the Offutt School of Business at Concordia College. My name is Per Anderson, Interim Director of the Center. Established 9 years ago, the Center honors the life of Norman Lorenzen, Concordia graduate, CEO of Burlington Northern Railway, Regent of the College, and generous philanthropist. The center seeks to integrate faith and work in support of the vision of the Offutt School to serve society through ethical leaders who are confident, curious, and globally competent. We continue this evening our conversation about consequential change and disruption in the world of work and important struggles, both old and new, that workers and employers face. We are seeking this year to understand the meaning making that people do at work and in life beyond work. In November, with the help of human resources experts Jill Berg and Joyce Norrells, we examined record level job resignations occurring today, which hit a new high in November, and looked at traits and sources of this alarming trend. We discussed how the pandemic has revealed and exacerbated massive and persisting disengagement and disappointment with paid work at every level today. Among the reasons workers are quitting, the top ones, according to McKinsey, are number one, employees do not feel valued by their managers and companies, and number two, they do not feel a sense of belonging at work. According to the interdisciplinary research of Emily Esfahani-Smith in her important book, The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters, when workers do not feel they matter to others and do not enjoy compassionate and high-quality connections with their coworkers, they cannot experience at work two of the four pillars of a meaningful life: belonging and purpose. For Smith, belonging is the most important driver in the search for meaning. With Smith, we should not be surprised when workers speak of meaning and purpose as things they seek and even expect at work. Because work typically occupies most of our adult lives, if work has no meaning, our life can be bereft of meaning too. In a recent Minnesota Public Radio interview with Kathy Werzer, Phyllis Moen, a distinguished sociologist at the University of Minnesota who researches work and well-being, talked about the Great Resignation as the Great Reappraisal. Millions of workers are on the move in response to unsustainable demands on their work and just feeling stuck. They are indeed looking for more meaning and purpose at work, and they are looking for more control to manage other responsibilities. More meaning, purpose, and control at work today. What could be wrong with that? This evening, we focus upon the quest for meaning in life and the place of work in this quest, both descriptively and normatively. Before I introduce our guest, I want to share thoughts from thinkers who inform our conversation this year. The first comes from the philosopher Anthony Kronman in his book, Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. Our lives, he says, are the most important resources we possess. And the question of how to spend them is the most important question we face. The lives we actually lead are the more or less well thought out answers we give to this question. Our answer depends, of course, on what we value and where we find fulfillment. How should I spend my life? That question immediately invites another. What do I most care about and why? For the sake of what or who am I living? What is my life for? The second comes from theologians Miroslav Volf and Matthew Kroosman in their book, For the Life of the World, Theology That Makes a Difference. A compelling vision of flourishing life is not a luxury. A cozy reading room for a middle-class home that already has a kitchen, bathroom, living space, and bedrooms. It is a basic need of a being who does not and cannot live by bread alone. All humans in all cultures, each in their own way, aspire to genuine flourishing in their own way, in their for their own sake and for those that they care for. First, we are inescapably oriented to some good toward things, states of affairs, practices, and emotions we perceive as good. Second, we are reflective and moral beings. We want to know that the good we strive toward is in fact desirable. Finally, aware as we are of living in time, we gather our past in memory and our future in anticipation. And we want to be assured of the goodness and rightness of our whole life. Truly flourishing life is the most important concern of our lives. What is my life for? What should I live for? What is flourishing life? How can I flourish in life? We turn now to the role work can and should play in what we care most about and what we live for. We are fortunate this evening to welcome Jonathan Malesic to our conversation to help us examine the realities of work today and to explore the quest for meaning and purpose and flourishing at work today and beyond. Based upon years of research and his own experience, Jonathan has much to say about these matters and addresses them in a groundbreaking book just out, The End of Burnout: Why Work Drains Us and How to Build Better Lives. Jonathan is an essayist, journalist, and scholar whose writing has been recognized as notable in Best American Essays and Best American Food Writing, and has received special mention in the Pushcart Prize anthology. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, Washington Post, America, Commonweal, Notre Dame Magazine, the Hedgehog Review, The Point, Chronicle of Higher Education, and elsewhere. He's been a recipient of major grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Louisville Institute. He has a doctorate in religious studies from the University of Virginia and has taught theology and writing at universities across the country. He joins us tonight from Dallas. Welcome, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you so much for that introduction and just for hosting me. And thanks to the Lorenzen Center and its benefactors. Thanks to Concordia College, to the Lutheran Synod, to the Fargo and Moorhead community, and just to all of you for being here.
Thank you. And welcome again to our audiences here in Barry Auditorium and online. We are going to invite you to submit questions. I will be getting some questions texted to me from online. In about 40 minutes, we'll turn to some open mic here in the auditorium. So please prepare for that part of the conversation. Our scheduled conclusion is 8 o'clock, but Jonathan has kindly consented to go a bit longer if we have things that we want to learn from him. So with that, we will begin. We're going to take our conversation sort of in three parts. What's really going on in our culture with work today? What's going wrong? How did we get there? And then look at his ideas for what we can do to make work better. So that's the order of our thinking here. So I want to begin with the big picture of American life, Jonathan. You argue in your book for some really fundamental change in the place of work in American life. You think the way we work today largely dehumanizes us. It fails to serve our dignity and our potential. And you definitely believe with Miroslav Volf that we deserve a work life worthy of our humanity. So your alternative calls for public conversation about matters of the heart and the soul, about what we value, what we live for above all. Something that Americans, tend to privatize. We can be pretty quick to call out the religious speech of our neighbors as imposing upon our public freedom. So, and yet you see a common faith empowering and guiding the way we work. You've even written that we see work as a god in the United States, and you agree with those who say we practice workism. You call this faith total work, and we'll be talking about that and trying to understand that. You're borrowing from philosopher Joseph Pieper. Before we get into your critique, I'm wondering if you could talk about the spiritual and existential climate of work today. These reports about workers looking for meaning and purpose, do they make sense to you? Do you see people opening their hearts and souls in public, especially in the pandemic? Are we in the midst of another great awakening of religion in the United States? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see what are to me a lot who is critical of much of the way that we work. I see quite a few hopeful signs right now, and we should just back up a little bit. Before the pandemic, there was quite a bit of concern about burnout in 2019 and before. There was a sense then that something wasn't quite right with the way that we were working. And this was a feeling that really welled up in the millennial generation. So people who are, for the most part, early in their careers and feeling like they've gotten a bad deal in some respects. And then the pandemic, of course, upset our entire work lives, virtually everyone's, in one way or another. And I know we'll talk a bit more about how that happened. But now, 2 years in, and fingers crossed, with the end in sight, or at least the end perhaps imaginable, I do think that we are seeing hopeful signs, like many of the examples that you mentioned in the introduction. But in addition, I would add, yeah, there is this concept of the Great Resignation. There was a really surprising strike wave in the manufacturing and healthcare sectors in the fall. And these are workers who have borne a lot of the brunt of they've done a lot of the heavy lifting in the pandemic, in manufacturing, and nurses on the front lines. And they're saying that they're organizing and saying we need to be treated better. In addition, there are some perhaps strange and promising movements that you can see in, for instance, even on Reddit. There's this anti-work conversation that is occurring there. And what I see in all of this is two things. I mean, one thing that's clear is that American workers are recognizing and exercising a power on the labor market that they have not had in quite some time, perhaps decades. And so they're in a position where they can make a few more demands. And some of those demands are not just for higher pay, but also better conditions and greater recognition. And in addition, I can't say for certain, and I hope that there will be good social science and good journalism to explore this further. But I have a hope that recognition of market value will lead to a greater recognition of the human value of workers. That market value will one day dissipate for sure. That's certainly one thing that we know about markets. But my hope is that it will leave an imprint of a recognition of the human value of workers, that Wolf was talking about, and that will persist, and that workers will be able to have better conditions and lead better lives, even once their, for now, market power eventually declines.
Okay. I know you think we're in a moment of historical significance that we haven't seen in 50 years and we need to capture. We'll get back to that point because it's a very important part of your argument, I think. But let's go into the insights that you've put together in the last few years. You've studied work for many, many years, but your book has origins in your own painful experience as a theology professor at a college like Concordia. And you wanted to understand something that you think affects perhaps about 50% of the workforce on some level. So tell us a bit about what happened to you, and what have you lately come to understand about the norms and the arrangements that define most of work today?
Yeah, to be a college theology professor was my dream from almost the moment that I met my own college theology professors. I saw these men and women, and it just seemed like they lived the good life. They lived the life of the mind, and I wanted to live that too. And so I did the things that you do to get that job, and eventually I did. And there was quite a bit that was wonderful in it. I got to realize my dream, and I taught, I published, I got tenure, all of those things. But sometime after getting tenure, the dream started to feel more and more unreal. I found it difficult to get out of bed in the morning. I found it difficult to plan for class. I just couldn't even remember how to teach a good class, it seemed like. And I became more frustrated. My temper became very short, and I knew that something was wrong. And all along, work and the moral and spiritual questions it raises had been an important area for me of teaching and research. And I taught a class called Why Work as a moral theology course. But then that question became not just an academic one, but an existential one for my life. I could no longer understand how this job that I had loved fit into a flourishing life, because I was no longer flourishing, that's for sure. And this went on for a couple of years, including a period of unpaid leave, where I went away from the college. I went to live in another city for a while, and came back, and nothing had changed. I was every bit as miserable. And so I was saved ultimately by my wife, who is also an academic, and she got a job here in Texas. And so she signed her contract, and I signed my letter of resignation. And it was in the subsequent weeks after that, after deciding to quit my dream job, that I started to think, well, what was this? What happened to me? And a term that I kind of latched onto was burnout. And being an academic, which is to say basically a nerd, I decided to try to understand my own life through research. And so I looked into the psychological literature on burnout, and it seemed to make so much sense of my experience. And as I kept reading and researching, I realized that burnout was not just a problem for me, but for millions of workers. And eventually I settled on this notion that we live in what I call a burnout culture. So we have an entire cultural apparatus of our ideals and our expectations for work that set us up for burnout. And the way that worked for me was that idea of the dream job, the idea that I would totally fulfill my life and all of my dreams through my job, that being a college professor simply was who I was. And being a college professor is a great thing. In many ways, I wish that I still were one. But that's expecting way too much of work. And so much of that personal investment, I think, is misplaced, particularly when we look at, as I know we'll talk about more, but as we look at how precarious employment so often is.
So part of your analysis of how you got to burnout is a function of this cultural phenomenon, this faith that we'll call total work. So could we unpack that a bit, what that means to you, the characteristics of it? Because you definitely would claim you were caught up in that. That was part of your exhaustion. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, total work. So it's this concept that comes from the philosopher Joseph Pieper and his 1948 book, Leisure, The Basis of Culture, which is a marvelous short book that I fully endorse to everyone. But yeah, where I think that the total work doesn't only mean that we work a lot. It certainly means that. But I think that the way it manifests now is that work is the primary and sometimes the only moral vocabulary that we have to talk about the worthiness of actions. And so just think about, I mean, things that you may have said today. We talk about school as being students' job, and we talk about school as being hard work. We talk about marriage and other relationships as hard work. We talk about parenting as hard work, as an especially challenging job. We talk about mental health as work. You know, I have to really work on my mental health or something. We even sometimes talk about death as work, death, which is going to happen to you regardless of the amount of effort that you expend or not. We even talk about death as work. And I think that that's a really narrow moral vocabulary, because once you start talking about these things at work, you start to bring in all the other terminology that we associate with work and all the other concepts. We start to talk about efficiency. We start to measure ourselves by the effort that we're putting in rather than the results or even the goals. You know, the good of marriage is not found in the amount of effort you put into it, but it's found, you know, just in the relationship itself and the commitment that you share. And likewise, parenting is not, you know, the good parent is not necessarily the person who puts the most effort in, but rather the one who has the judgment and the compassion and the love to see their child's development and their child's flourishing. So work is not it's actually an inadequate moral term for talking about these activities, but it's the only one we have. And that's one way that work kind of colonizes ever more of our minds.
So we're talking about a mindset, and you want to insert leisure into that, and we'll get to that part of it following again, Joseph Pieper. In practical terms, you know, you also want to think about the fact that Americans do have some leisure life. We do have a robust entertainment culture. People must point out to you that they have hobbies. They say, well, I'm not one of that 50%. I have work-life balance. You probably have experienced a little pushback on this idea that we're all caught up in this total work. So how do you understand the current character of leisure life and today?
Sorry. We certainly do have leisure, although I think that we often even reduce leisure to work too. You can think about it in the simple notion of how we think about a weekend. You know, what is the good of a weekend? Is the purpose of a weekend so that you can be rested and ready for work on Monday? Or is the weekend an end in itself? You know, are we working for the weekend, as the song goes? So one of the problems that I see with leisure is that we often have the wrong priority. We see leisure as a means to an end, as a means to make us better workers. You can think about the discourse around self-care similarly. One way that self-care gets talked about is that, well, I need to take care of myself so that I can be a better worker, and so I need to draw boundaries around my work. I think that's total work all over again. I think that, you know, I'm just following Pieper on this, but leisure needs to be primary in Pieper's view. And I think that there are other ways that we tend to reduce leisure to work would be in there's pressure to monetize our hobbies, to, make them profitable enterprises, or to be competitive in our hobbies, or, what is often, maybe the saddest thing that I sometimes hear from my own students. And yes, I do I still teach part-time, but I talk to students about their career goals and their leisure, and they really resist Pieper's notion that leisure ought to come first. And I ask them to expand on that. And they say, well, if I work really hard, then I'm going to earn promotions, I'm going to make a lot of money, and then I can have better leisure down the road. And, this, I think, I don't think there is such a thing as better leisure. I don't think that, I think that leisure is, however you spend it, like that's the end in itself. That, again, Pieper is the kind of pinnacle of human existence. And to think about it in terms of better and worse leisure is itself to have totally succumbed to the ideology of total work.
Okay, that's helpful. Let's now turn to sort of where we've been in the last 50 years, because it's a really important part of your argument. You see burnout as this tension between our ideals, our expectations, and the realities of work, and you track those ideals. We'll talk about that, but I think it would be good to start with your critique of what's happened to labor generally since the 1970s, and because you see it as a set of conditions that really challenge us in ways that you think are historically, if not unique, but they're historically important. So what are some of the changes, the broad changes that we're all caught up in with the nature of work?
Right. Yeah. Burnout appeared on the cultural and in the psychological literature in the early to mid 1970s. So the first psychology papers on burnout were published in 1973 and 1974. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that those psychologists were reacting to, and perhaps they were even anticipating in some sense, massive changes that were occurring in the American work experience. So, and historians now see 73, 74 as a huge watershed year in American culture, when so much changed, and particularly in American labor culture. So, we talk about the post 1945 economic boom as this heyday of American labor, when the manufacturing economy was unrivaled in the world, and productivity was rising, and workers really enjoyed the benefits of that productivity. Wages rose in tandem with their productivity. And the labor movement simultaneously had huge power and influence. Well, in 1973 or 74, all of that changed. That was the moment, that was the pinnacle of American labor power, and it's been largely in decline since then. It was also the pinnacle of the manufacturing economy. After that period, it became standard practice, and partly due to competition with new economic rivals, but it was the era of mass layoffs, and it was also the era when wages and productivity no longer rose in tandem. So workers' productivity and economic output continued to increase post 1974, but wages have mostly flatlined since then. Maybe there's some changes now, depending on how you think about the recent wage growth and its relation to inflation and all of that. But in any case, so workers are extremely productive and not getting the fruits of their labor quite as much as they did in the post-war years. But also the economy shifted from one driven primarily by manufacturing to one primarily driven by services. And millions of women entered the full-time workforce as well. And all of those changes, I think, are reflected in the rise of burnout as a as a keyword for explaining the problems with work, because what all of those changes kind of amount to is workers getting less return for their labor, greater uncertainty around their labor. And with the shift to the service economy, suddenly the means of production are the workers' own minds, personalities, enthusiasm, attitudes, all of that. So work begins to occupy more of who we are, more of our personal space. And we're very much still in, labor conditions that are a lot like, we're certainly living through that same change. I think that technology has changed quite a bit, but the underlying shape of work's role in our society has not changed. And I think that that is reflected in the fact that we're still having this conversation about burnout almost 50 years later.
I was really struck by your point about the service economy in terms of the emotional toll that work can take. And we could also talk about the precarity going on with the gig economy. And there are other trends that add to this kind of shift of responsibility from employers to workers and things like that. But meantime, during this period, expectations for the meaning of work are also on the rise, right? And so can we go back to this idea of what is it that's driving, this incredible attention to the dignity of work, the importance of that. Where do you see that coming from, and what's driving that today? Why do we work so hard today? And even when, as you point out, even it's ironically the best paid workers in the culture today are among the most hardworking people in the culture.
Right. Yeah. And that paradox that you look at, you look at the salary data, and you see that people with higher incomes and higher wealth are often, like you said, working more hours, even though in principle they don't need to. This is a total reversal of the condition at the end of the 19th century when Thorstein Veblen wrote about the leisure class. So the rich were a leisure class. Well, now the rich are a working, a class that values hard work tremendously and wants to demonstrate their worth through their work. And I think that that's a signal that we don't just work for pay. That's not our only concern. That's not our only goal when we go to work or when we embark on a career. We're always working for ideals. We're working for something immaterial. And I think this is important because burnout occurs in this gap between our ideals for work and the reality of our job. So the higher our ideals are, and the greater that gap between ideal and reality is, the greater the likelihood that we're going to experience burnout. And so, I've just been talking about how on the macro level, the conditions of work have diminished in the past several decades, but simultaneously, our ideals for work have only grown. I think about in 1963, Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique argued that, in the middle of the post-war boom, the post-war boom has solved the problem of productivity. And now we're going to have to work for transcendent reasons. And the way that idea has evolved over the past several decades is we view work more as a site of finding purpose. We view work as a site of finding some kind of spiritual goods. And that has been promoted. I think it's been promoted quite a bit in business schools and by like management gurus and so on, who argue that you will be fulfilled as a human being if you engage with your work. And oh, by the way, engaged workers are also very profitable. But I think that notion that you must engage with work it raises the stakes of your labor. It makes work matter more. It raises those ideals, and then it exposes you to burnout if that reality doesn't match up. Because I mean, you're not ideals just on their own don't make for happy and productive workers, and I think that that's a mistake that we often hear in the discourse around business and human resources. It's like, well, if people have a sense of purpose, if they have a sense that their work matters, if they have a vocation, then productivity and worker satisfaction will take care of itself. But that simply isn't true. There needs to be conditions for the worker that match the ideals that we're encouraging workers to bring to their jobs.
One of the ideas that runs from your diagnosis of what's going on to your solution is the idea of dignity. Could you talk to us about how we understand dignity in this total work system and the sort of promise of American work, and then where we need to go, and then that can take us perhaps in that direction? We should also spend a little time thinking about, again, where this is coming from, but this seems really important to your thought.
It is, yeah. And you hear particularly politicians talk a lot about the dignity of work. And there's at least two ways of thinking about what that phrase might mean. And the way that a lot of politicians talk about it, what they mean is that a person, without a job lacks dignity. And so then they get a job and they have dignity. And that idea is that, yeah, you gain dignity through labor. And I think that's an idea that is what's another one of those like ideals that are meant to kind of take care of themselves. Like, oh, well, you're getting dignity, so it doesn't matter how much you were making at work. But I think that there's another notion of dignity that you sometimes hear in public life, but I know that I hear it quite a bit in my own Roman Catholic moral tradition. And so the popes, since 1891 at least, have written quite a bit about the dignity of work. And they emphasize, however, that the dignity of work begins with the dignity that each one of us has as a human being made in the image and likeness of God. So we each have dignity for our entire lives. Before we ever go to work, and if we never go to work. And that idea is at the basis of so much of Christian moral thought. And if you start there, then the dignity of work takes on a different meaning. John Paul II argues that work gains its dignity because the one who is working it has dignity already. And when you start to think about the dignity of work in that way, you realize that what needs to happen is that the conditions of employment, the conditions in which we labor, need to be adequate to the dignity that we already have. So the dignity of work we should think of it perhaps more as like the dignity of jobs. Do the jobs have sufficient dignity to match the dignity of the human being who is filling them?
So in your thought, dignity is, functions as a way in which to begin to improve the work that we do. Work needs to be better. But you also make a provocative argument for less work. And I think we should look at that, and then we probably could look at some questions from our folks in the audience. So talk to us about how you see dignity, a new sense of dignity rising up and changing the quality of work, and where's that going to come from in the culture if we don't have it right now? I mean, we do have traditions that are insisting on this, but where do you see that arising? And then how does it follow that from the dignity of work, of the importance of good work, that it should also involve less work?
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, where is this notion of dignity going to come from? Like, it exists in the culture, right? But it's not widespread yet. It's not something that everybody sees. And this is a place where the churches and other religious organizations have a huge role to play. I so rarely, if ever, hear of homilies on work, and yet you read the Gospels, and work, the parables are constantly said in terms of work. There are labor metaphors all over the place in the Gospels. I think we're sometimes not seeing the radicalism in some of the gospel passages that we think of as, we think that some of them are endorsing hard work and vocation, but think of the call of the first disciples. Jesus isn't calling them to work, he's calling them away from work. They're fishermen, they're doing ordinary fisherman things, and he says, quit your job and follow me. And I think that we don't acknowledge that more shocking mode of discipleship. I know, speaking at a Lutheran institution, I immediately think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, cheap grace and costly grace. I think that we read a lot of cheap grace into the Gospels when it comes to work. Well, of course, Jesus is endorsing the work ethic. Of course, like, work is a good thing. Jesus endorses good things, then he must be endorsing the American work ethic. But I think that we're domesticating the gospel a little too much, and bending it too much to our culture, and not witnessing how it is challenging our culture. The gospel is always, whatever our culture is, the gospel is challenging it, right? So that's one step. But it's not only this different mode of thinking about work won't only come from the churches. Of course, it has to come from multiple sources in the culture. And I think that the pandemic is also it's an occasion for rethinking so much of our lives, and particularly the value of human life. I mean, the losses that our country and that families have endured have been massive, and we'll never know the full loss, not just in terms of lives, but in terms of everything else, for years. And again, this is a hope. I don't know for sure, but it's a hope that we'll recognize. Again, like I think the philosopher you quoted at the beginning, that our lives are all we have, and we need to spend them as well as possibly. And I mean that well in the broadest possible sense. That they need to be spent in pursuit of a broad and really ambitious sense of human flourishing. And finally, I forgot what I was going to say. I forgot the third point I had, but maybe it'll come back to me a little later on.
Well, before we go to questions, let's go back to let's go to the Benedictines.
Sure.
And what they contribute to the argument. So you're calling for three things. You're calling for a rethinking of the inherent dignity of the human. You're calling for communities of real compassion for one another, so workers have to develop solidarity. And then you're calling for leisure. And of course, you include within that worship, which doesn't necessarily occur to people, right? But that's obviously, as you say, Pieper's principal understanding of leisure is the life of worship. And so you want more leisure in our lives. You want real leisure. So what is it? What have you found in the Benedictines that impresses you about reaching those norms? And then again, maybe you could comment again on the potential of other religious communities to develop those forms of life as well. Because again, they're antidotes to total work.
Right. Yeah. And I remembered my third thing, which was less work, which I'll get to by talking through the Benedictines. Yeah. I mean, so I went, at the end of the book, I went looking for individuals, workplaces, communities that are resisting burnout culture, that are establishing, intentionally or not, a counterculture that we perhaps don't need to imitate exactly, but that we can all learn from. And one of those sets of communities are Benedictine religious communities. In fact, I visited 3 communities in 2 locations. So one was the Monastery of Christ in the Desert in northern New Mexico, and the other 2 were in Collegeville and St. Joseph, Minnesota, St. John's Abbey and St. Benedict's Monastery. And what I found, and particularly the monks in New Mexico, they have really left the world. It's their monastery is very hard to get to. It's 13 miles down a very pitted and windy and sometimes treacherous and sometimes impassable dirt road. And they generate their own electricity. They're increasingly growing more and more of their own food. And they put the priority on communal prayer. That is the most important thing to them. And they need to work, as we all do, to to have the things that they need in order to survive. But for them, the most important thing is prayer. And they spend 5 or 6 hours a day together in the chapel, chanting the Psalms and the daily office, as well as, an hour or 2 of private prayer generally. And that doesn't leave a ton of time for work. And so their work period begins at 9 in the morning, and they're tending livestock, they're doing paperwork, they're cooking, they're cleaning, all that stuff. And then the chapel bell rings again at 12:40 p.m. and they stop what they're doing. They put their work away, they clean up if need be, they go to the chapel and they pray together once again. And they don't go back to work in the afternoon. They're done. And that, when I asked a monk about what happens when the bell rings and you feel like your work is undone, what do you do? And this is a man who had been a defense attorney. So he had lived the life of total work in the world. And he said, you get over it. And that struck me as an important spiritual discipline, the spiritual discipline of getting over it, getting over our work and seeing that there's something better. And so like that, what I take from the Benedictines is that they truly do aim to honor each other's dignity. When you're committed to that community, you're there for life and you are supported for life. And if you can no longer work, if you're not physically able, you're still completely cared for. You belong to the community. And if nothing else, you can pray, you can offer intentions on behalf of the rest of the community and the world. So you're valued, throughout your life. And there's this strong limit on work in the recognition that there's something more important. And so I think as a culture, we need to begin identifying those things that are more important than our work. What is it that our work is meant to support? And the Benedictine communities have identified that. And that's why I think that they're an interesting model for those of us whose lives are in some ways very different.
All right, let's go to some questions. Please go to the mic if you'd like to address Jonathan, and I'm going to look at some questions that have come in online, and we'll get to those. But let me start with a question from the audience here. You please.
So again, thank you for being with us. Just a question about kind of the internal versus the external. I think your burnout and that is thinking about internal, and we can all have a sense of what that is. But will this change in our culture, change in our employment, also have an external change? I was talking to a parishioner of mine who had well, why is there so much, why are there so many job openings? Well, nobody wants to go to work, right? I mean, he was very, very conservative person. And I said, well, that might be true, but it might be true also that people just aren't putting up with crap anymore at their job. And he had a very interesting comment. He said, yep, I worked in management, and we'd have, a young person coming up in the company, and they'd want to get a promotion, and they'd sit back in their meeting and they'd say, well, what's he going to do if we don't give him one? Is he going to quit? And they decide, no, there's nothing else. At that time, there were no other jobs. So he's not going to quit. Well, then why should we give him a promotion? A perfect example. He realized that himself. We treated our employees like dirt. They were replaceable, expendable. And I've had jobs with that too, especially in construction and other things where you're just expendable. Sales, just expendable. And do you think we'll see a change in that in the management structure? So that's more of an external question.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate your kind of giving voice to something that I think we're hearing quite a bit in the culture right now. Well, why are there all of these job openings? And I hope that there's a change in management outlook. I mean, I can't say for sure that there will be, but certainly one thing that you brought to mind. I mean, a promotion usually is, it has a monetary component to it, but it's more than that. It's also about recognition, and when we think about the reward that workers get for their labor, I think that we need to think about it certainly in terms of monetary compensation. Obviously, people care a lot about that, but often what contributes to burnout is just being overlooked. That's how people can feel like their work doesn't matter, is if no one ever recognizes it. And I talk in the book about for a nonprofit organization here in Dallas that at their staff meetings they have a dedicated item on the agenda which they call "You Better Recognize," and so they recognize and thank anyone in the organization who has done something that seemed like it was above and beyond. And so whether it is winning $1 million grant, or cleaning and preparing a room for a meeting. If someone did something that mattered to you, you have a forum to acknowledge that. And small things like that can make a big difference in people feeling worthy, feeling dignified through their labor.
Jonathan, we have two questions here further about dignity. One person online says, what is worker dignity in the context of business, which can figure at will or quote unquote restructure and downsize at the direction of top executives?
Yeah, well, I would say that they shouldn't. They shouldn't do that, basically, because of human dignity. Well, or I should say, yeah, right. I mean, there's certainly, businesses need to take into account the fact that the decisions that they're making affect human lives, and they affect the hopes that people have for their lives, and that their work often, helps to foster. We aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or boxes on an org chart, and that needs to be taken into account. And perhaps workers themselves ought to. Perhaps decision making shouldn't be entirely top down in that respect. Are there ways of solving whatever problem the business is facing that will not necessitate, mass layoffs or something like that? Could something else be done? Keep in mind, I am more of a theologian than a management scholar, but I think that management could earn a goodwill by viewing the workers often as true collaborators in whatever project. And business is ultimately a social arrangement, and we need to keep in mind that the people that we work with, that we work for, and who work for us are people that we're in a social relationship with, and be able to see the dignity in them and allow that to inform our decisions.
The second question says, is the speaker, is Jonathan Malesic, familiar with Interreligious Network for Worker Solidarity at George Washington University?
I
You know
am
anything
not.
about that? Okay.
No.
Are you?
I'm
Can
gonna
you
make a note of that.
Okay, so I would say the questioner is interested in movements that are in our midst that are trying to raise up the dignity of workers. Are you familiar with any other expressions of that you see that we should be attending to?
Off the top of my head, I cannot think of good examples. But yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the certainly like the notion of solidarity, you know, seen as a religious good, I think can help us a lot. You know, can motivate us. And, you know, again, you know, from the Christian tradition, I think a lot about Paul on the body of Christ, and recognizing that if one member suffers, they all do. And I think that that sense of solidarity is one that the pandemic has also helped to reveal to us. If one person is sick, then many others can be sick as well. And so, you know, your health and my health are entirely linked. And that's also true when it comes to burnout. When I was first burning out as a college professor, I did think primarily of, you know, it being my problem. I thought, you know, why am I being hurt? In the subsequent years, I've started to think, well, maybe I was being hurt because other people I worked with were undergoing burnout. And maybe while I was undergoing burnout, I was also causing undue stress to my own students and, you know, contributing to some form of burnout in them. I think that we've got to recognize that those experiences are very much linked. I mean, burnout is not quite like a viral disease, but it exists because we are in social relation to each other.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing book and great conversation. I was just reflecting on, you know, our Lutheran heritage as a college and our mission statement, and our kind of one of the thematic elements, of course, is service to the neighbor. And I think about that word service and how it relates to the concept of work, or maybe it's at times in opposition to it. But I also think of leisure and whether leisure can include service to the neighbor. And so I'm just thinking about the sort of the dignity of serving, and how does that relate to this concept of work and leisure? Is it a third leg of the stool, or is it related to one or the other of them? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we do usually just think of this this dichotomy. Something is either work or it's leisure. And I was talking about parenting and school and things like that early on, and they don't fit either category very well. Parenting does not, I think, often feel like leisure. And yeah, school, likewise. I mean, Pieper thinks that school is leisure. Most students don't see it that way, and that's fair enough. And likewise, service and you know, enacting neighbor love, it doesn't feel like, you know, going to the amusement park. It doesn't feel like a picnic. So I think that we probably do need a third category between work and leisure for those activities that are not really good fits for either one. So, you know, all the things that I've mentioned probably fit in there. You know, what defines work is its economic productivity. And what defines leisure is that it's an activity that is good just in and of itself. It's an end in itself. And all these other things usually aim at some good that is not reducible to economic productivity. And so, the good of schooling is the educated person. The good of parenting is, a flourishing child who reaches adulthood. And yeah, the good of service is, the good of the other. So I don't know what word we would use for that category, and I really want to think about it. But I think that we probably do, in order to expand our moral vocabulary, we will need a term for those activities.
And of course, one of the words from the tradition about those activities is callings. Just want you to know that in future programs, we're really going to try to dig down on that and see what that can do to address precisely, I would say, the kind of total work that you're criticizing. So thank you for that. As we close down here, we have a question about generations that I'd like you to have an opportunity to talk about how you see young Americans right now and perhaps speak to their reality. So the question goes like this. You've spoken of burnout among millennials, for example, and you can tell us about Ann Peterson's work, I think, on that. I'm at full retirement age, but still working. What are your research findings for the so-called boomer generation vis-a-vis work-life balance and work meaning compared to younger generations? So how does this burnout culture play out across the generations right now?
Yeah, when I was first thinking about burnout, it sort of made sense to me. It made a kind of straightforward sense that, well, you would expect burnout to grow as a person progresses through their career. And so like you start out like really eager and you have a lot of energy and low burnout. And over time, the experience of working and, various indignities and frustrations build up and you become more and more burned out. Almost the exact opposite is true. You tend to, it's not a stark finding, but you tend to see in study after study more burnout in earlier career workers. And I don't think that's entirely a generational thing. So yeah, Ann Helen Peterson, who wrote a book on millennial burnout and now has another new book on remote working, it had really brought attention to this idea of millennial burnout. And I think the real strength of what she is doing is she shows how an entire generation kind of bought into what I would call, what people would call the world of total work or burnout culture. She kind of charts like, well, these were millennials' experiences in school and earlier in their careers. This is how their ideals got to be so high. And this is how the reality got to, did not live up to it. What I'm not totally sold on, I guess, in that argument is that I don't know that it's a problem that's specific to, millennials, people born between, 1981 and 96 or something like that. But rather, I think a lot of it just has to do with being early in their careers. So when you're earlier in your career, often your ideals are very high. You have been told your whole life that work is going to fulfill you. You've heard graduation speakers, you've heard pastors and parents and guidance counselors, telling you to give your all into your work. And you envision your career and you have a lot of energy, and so you invest a lot of energy into it. Also, early career workers are often paid very poorly. They are often worked very hard, and they don't necessarily see those promotions that they might dream of. And so it's actually early career workers who are often most susceptible to burnout. And what happens is that if you go into a career and it doesn't go as you expected and you experience burnout, well, what are you going to do? You might quit and move into a totally different career, and you find that it's one that you can do and that you're very satisfied with. And so when you look at the data on burnout and age cohorts, the people who are in their 50s and 60s and are not feeling burned out might just be the ones who never burned out to begin with, or they're the ones who changed careers and settled on one that really works well for them. And like if you burn out, you just don't persist in that career for the most part. So I don't think there's anything that like we age out of burnout, or I don't think there's anything in the boomer generation that is especially resistant to burnout. It's just that, the older generations have gone through it and they've landed in a spot where burnout was not as prevalent, and the younger generation just haven't got there yet.
In our next program, we're actually going to look at young Americans and try to ask about these kind of questions about what their expectations are. So this is really important. I think in closing, I'd like to give you an opportunity, Jonathan, to say anything that you haven't had a chance to say tonight, but also perhaps maybe you have some pointers for students. I've indicated to you that Concordia is becoming very intentional about preparation for work. We have an initiative called Learn, Work, Lead. That's very important to us. We're also aware of how that can be sucked into certain kind of norms and paradigms that we want to be careful about. And we have our own mission about how we want to think about social responsibility and about meaningful life and about service to the neighbor, as was mentioned by one of my colleagues. So what suggestions would you have, or recommendations would you have for us to try to craft a curriculum of work, given all the reflection you've given to this topic? I wish I could have taken your Why Work course. I'm sure it was fascinating. What do you think we need to get in front of our students to help them really understand the realities and to claim ideals that are fitting and needful in the human experience?
Yeah, and again, before we go, I do want to thank you, Per, and everyone who is here for your attention. And I hope that I hope you will get the book and read it, and I hope that it's valuable to you. But yeah, I mean, I have a few words for the main takeaway is simply for ordinary workers, just talk about this, talk about your ideals for work, what it is that motivates you to get up and do your work every day, and where those ideals have, where your work has not measured up to those ideals. What is it that frustrates you, and what might it look like? What could a different situation at your work look like, so to sort of narrow that gap? Burnout it's experienced by the individual, but it's not caused by the individual. The causes are in our workplaces, in our culture, and all of that is shared. So if we just remain isolated, we're never going to solve the problem. Now, these conversations about work and ideals and the way that work doesn't measure up might sound scary to employers and supervisors. Like, oh my goodness, are people going to have these conversations and there's going to be a mass quit, or they're going to, organize against me or something like that. And I want to encourage you, not to fear these conversations. And the reason is that workers flourishing as human beings is significantly in your hands as supervisors and employers. You have tremendous responsibility toward them. And you have, in a way, a greater responsibility to employees who spend 40 or more hours a week within your organization than to your customers and clients, whom you have much more limited interactions with. If your organization is going to promote human flourishing, it's got to start with the flourishing of your employees. You have tremendous responsibility toward them, and you hired them believing in their goodness as workers and their value as humans. And so I would say, don't fear these conversations, because they can be the pathway to you doing greater promotion of human flourishing through the work that your organization does. And for students, I understand all the pressure that you face to treat education as a job or as a means to a job. And sometimes students, again, understandably, look at their education as a way to get their first job, and then, they'll kind of figure everything out after that. And I want to encourage you to look much, much further in the future and have a much broader vision of your education. Keep in mind that you will not always be a worker in your life. There will come a time when you will stop working. And throughout your life, now, during your education, in the future, during your career, you will always be a human being with many more facets to you than your economic productivity. And the education that you are in the middle of right now is valuable for more than just that first job or more than just your career. It is, meant to be an education for the entire human being for their entire lifetime, to give you tools that you can exercise in order to flourish, not just economically, but personally, morally, spiritually, all of that. So I encourage you to think more broadly about what your education has to offer you as a human being and to take full advantage of it.
Wow. Thank you for this wisdom. This is fantastic. Jonathan, on behalf of the entire Concordia community, I want to thank you for a most illuminating and thought-provoking conversation this evening. You provoked us to ponder what we live for and a life worthy of our humanity. You've helped us to understand dehumanizing things about work and to see how we might create work that honors our dignity and potential, and that supports flourishing life. And we wish you all the best in your ongoing research and your advocacy for the revision of this burnout culture. So thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you. This is a great pleasure.
I am grateful tonight to colleagues Carol Hedberg, Beth Ryerson, Anna Benson, Candace Harmon, Todd Walworth, Wade Iverson, Michael Vick, Eric Eliason, Susan Larson, Dawn Rude, Chris Mason, George Cannell, and Steph Offeld for assistance with our program. Thank you to our audience for joining and for your good questions. If you are new to this conversation and want to know more, videos of previous programs can be found at our website. Please join this conversation on March 8, when we talk with national experts Melinda Denton of the National Study on Youth and Religion and Josh Packard of the Springtide Research Institute on what faith, work, and flourishing mean to young people. Good night from the Lorenzen Center for Faith and Work at Concordia College. Keep safe, and wishing you good work now and in the future, graced with respect, engagement, and meaning.